In this episode of Supervision Simplified, we are doing part two on assessments, where we are talking about three assessments that go a little more in depth for the supervisor and their process and the supervisee's experience of supervision. And we will talk to you about how you can utilize those things and bridging the gap between theory and the practice of supervision. Stay tuned.
Hello there, and welcome to Supervision Simplified. I'm Dr. Amy Parks,
And I'm Valerie Harris.
and we're so excited to have you here today. I'm really excited to be recording from a fabulous different location. I'm recording from Atomic Brand Energy in branding and marketing studio in our office in Georgia, and so I'm in a little bit of a different location today. So I have a really cool environment to be in, and I know Valerie's in her cool office today, so we have a little bit of a different vibe going on. How
Yes.
how are you doing, Valerie?
Good, good. Yeah, doing great. If you just heard some sound in the background, that was the litter roboting. So that's done and it will not interrupt us again.
Good,
So just
fabulous.
real talk being, life happens.
Absolutely. It totally does. Totally does. Well, I heard from somebody on our episode about assessments that the assessment episode was life changing. That was the quote, life changing.
Oh,
And they didn't even know that we had a second episode in the can, or in the prepared to be launched and shared with them. And so I'm really excited to be able to share this one today. And that is on a little bit more of traditional assessment. So
mhm,
last time when we talked about assessment, we were talking about more around personality, more around fit, more around cultural culture of the practice, a lot of different kinds of ways of looking at assessment that examined sort of more about the individual and their sort of fit to the supervision sort of circumstance. And these we're going to talk about today are really designed very specifically around supervision
mhm.
and around the supervisor. And so I know that you and I have used all of these assessments before. We're going to link them in the show notes as well so that people have reference to them. But I wanted to start with the actual clinical supervisor self assessment. And I'm wondering, have you done your own self assessment before, Valerie?
Yes, I have. I did it very early on as a supervisor because I heavily rely on assessments. I've always loved assessments, one of my favorite things. So I like to have data, as most people know, spreadsheets, anything to track baselines and watch if things are working or not. And I think, yeah, doing that was what really helped me understand, oh, there's a whole lot more to being a supervisor than like that one little 12-hour class I had. I really need to do some more work. So it was very eye opening.
Yeah, and it's interesting too when you talk about your training as a supervisor, there are not a lot of assessments in supervisor training. So
Yeah.
this is really an adjunct and really an optional kind of opportunity. I noted that in California, their MFT supervisors there have a self-assessment requirement,
Oh,
but
good.
even the questions though on that self-assessment are much more around sort of compliance issues and not so much around attitudes or related to skills, abilities, and attitudes. So this particular one, that is the clinical supervisor self-assessment that we're going to be sharing with you, is kind of a it's a kind of a collaboration of a number of different instruments put together, but really it's a related instrument that talks about skills, abilities, attitudes, giving the supervisor an opportunity to really recognize things that they would like to improve as a supervisor, and
Mhm.
really giving us as supervisors a chance to plan our next steps in development as a
Mhm.
supervisor. And that is really the key because part of supervision or part of self assessment is being able to say, okay, where am I now? Am I good? Am I okay? Or could I stand some improvement? And then what is my plan for that improvement? So what do I need to do
Mhm.
next?
Yeah, like, it should be revealing blind spots of some
Exactly.
sort, and it is
Exactly.
interesting to me, and, I mean, we can pick up on this anywhere at some point, but it is very interesting to me that it would not be part of a training, or it would not be when everything else we do requires assessment and focuses around that as one of the core 8 competency areas. So that's just an observation of, like, still things that make you go, "Hmm," like, I just don't know how they didn't carry that over, but okay.
Right. Well, so the supervision credentialing process is in its of itself is very is very different in every state, and so there isn't sort of a prescription as to how it should be conducted. So there's nothing that says there's no there's no requirement that says
Uh,
every clinical supervisor should go through a course or a credit CE around assessment, around
I see what
supervision
you're saying.
assessment, and that makes perfect sense that it should. That
It
should be a
does.
requirement, but it isn't.
But it also sounds like what you're saying, and this makes sense where as I hear that now, if you don't have a standardized anything within that supervision process, which I think there are inherent standards, across the board in states, even though they may be loose, like there's still something that could be normalized and standardized, I would think.
Right, but there isn't.
But just like competencies, you know what I mean? But you're
Right.
right, if there's not and it's not been agreed upon, then to push that, you would have to have something that was standardized in some capacity and validated and replicated to actually push that as a standard. So, okay, on the flip side, it makes sense. It just still, from a practicality standpoint and an intentionality standpoint, doesn't make sense for good practice, I guess, long
Yeah,
term.
I'd really like to see. It's really actually interesting because I happen to sit on, as you know, I happen to sit on the ACEs subcommittee for supervision, and we're getting ready to put out our recommendations in supervision to the nation and to states nationwide this fall. And the section on supervision competencies for credentialing is one paragraph, and I just it blows my mind, and so as we're looking at the revision of that, because ACEs, like every other association, changes presidents every year. So because of that, the sort of the needs of the association and the priorities change and
Yeah.
things like that. So it hasn't been a priority, and then it was a priority, and then it wasn't, et cetera. So now we're looking at it again. And I said, why? Like we need to discuss why this is just one paragraph. And sort of the reason is, well, because every state credentials supervisors differently. And I just continue to ask why. But why does every
Yes,
state
5
why
whys.
does why the five whys, why does every state credential them differently? Like why is that a state, like why is there not a standard? And so I really am going to be sort of the fly in the ointment around this, because that
Yes.
just doesn't make any sense. So some of the questions, if we're going back to this supervision assessment, I want to just kind of go through a few of these because certainly I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of the key ones that I highlighted, which I think were really, really good. One of the ones, the first question is my attitude about supervision. Is my attitude about supervision good? Is it okay? Could it stand improvement? And I think you need to ask yourself, if you're saying it could stand improvement, you need to be saying, like, why am I doing this? Like, if my
Yeah.
attitude about supervision is problematic, then, that's really a question to wonder about. So I think,
Pivotal. I just wanna say something on that real quick because I think it lines up well. I notice that often with practices who take on interns, and, there seem to be some who do it and don't really like mentoring or teaching, and you can see it in the attitude towards the intern. And I think it's they s- at that point the intern seems more like it's more of a nuance or more of a nuisance, and sort of like, what do I do with them? Or, and sometimes it's just a lack of education, but other times it's really comes down to you don't like teaching and mentoring. If you don't like that, this probably isn't for you type of
Right.
thing. And so I think
Right.
the attitude piece is really important and could be that same question could transmit to a lot of different roles as a counselor fulfilling different roles. That's a really good place to ask and kind of get an idea of if you're in the right part of the field.
Right. Well, and speaking of different roles, another question here is not supervising when interfering dual relationships exist. So, how do you feel about that? Do you feel comfortable not supervising when interfering dual relationships exist?
I don't know. Like I'm in a dual relationship at all times with mine. I think what I feel comfortable with versus what I don't. What I do not feel comfortable with is supervising in isolation when a dual relationship exists. I do not think that if there were no other supervisor in my practice, um, I absolutely would not feel comfortable being the only supervisor. I think that's a very big power imbalance, and even if I'm acknowledging it and trying to mitigate it, to me, just the gold standard in that is to have accountability and always
Hmm.
have other people.
Hmm. Hmm. And I think that that's, I think we've talked about before, having the awareness of that is
Mhm.
so critical. And having checks and balances, having
Yes.
somebody who can really say, I'm really not sure you're really clear on how that relationship is problematic, or how you've approached that scenario is might be problematic.
And it has served us well, and I will say there have been times, and I wanna be clear because I think this could get misunderstood too. This supervisor works in my practice, so she is paid by my practice as an employee. However, where we're a little more balanced is we were in grad school together. We've worked together in other places. So she has the same level of experience. So she's not reliant on me as a supervisor. And so there's that piece. There's also the piece ethically where she is required to report me. And so there's that part of it. And it has served us well because there have been many times they will report things to her that they are not stating to me
Mm,
around some of the things that they're struggling with in work related things that they're not bringing to the table. And so we have conversations about, we need to talk about these. And she's like, do you want me to talk to Valerie about this? Would you prefer to do that? Should we do that together? And it's really made for better relationships with all of us in making sure that we're all on the same page. And so it really has created a safety for especially people who are newer or who maybe had met with her more frequently than me and felt more comfortable to really come forth and say certain things that they were having fear about because I'm the employer. So it's worked in that way, it has worked.
yeah, that's really powerful and really important to have that kind of relationship and that kind of opportunity for to check yourself and to be
Mhm.
checked by people around you. Another question here is confidence in my abilities with regard to supervising, assessment of supervisee in order to plan specific learning. So, not just being able to meet the supervisee where they are, which we all think is important, but also to be able to identify areas where your supervisee may need guidance in specific learning. And that may be areas where they see themselves as having lacking in understanding or learning, but you saying, this may be an area where you may need to do, or I would like to assign you this area to do some more specific research and some more specific training.
Yeah. Can I ask how you do that, how you go about that in your practice? If you have a process that you do, because I'd love to hear about it. I have one that I use, but I'd really like to hear yours too.
Yeah, so if we feel like it's somewhat organic. It's not really a formalized system,
Mhm,
although we do know that if somebody comes in and they are working with our population and they really state early on that there's a
mhm,
specific part of our population that they're not very familiar with. So say for example, the number one area where people our practice is children, teens and families. The number one or the I guess the two top areas where people have the most sort of trepidation or, indicate the lack of training is working with parents and then in
Mhm.
doing family work. Like that's,
Yeah.
people are like, "Oh, I can do kids. Oh, I can do teens. Oh, I can do adults." But parents freak them out. And the idea of doing family work is just like, no way. They're just not really, we don't have MFTs are not a thing in our area. So that's just
Mhm.
not really a popular area or modality that people are really comfortable with. So right away, we pretty much always identify that people need support and training and working with parents. So we pretty much put them into some training that we've developed around working with parents right away. So that's something that we almost automatically know that they're going to need.
Mhm.
um, and then the family piece, if people haven't worked with families or, that's an area where they feel like that there's a weakness, then we will have them start doing some training in that area. But usually it's going to be on the job training. Like they're going to be doing some observation with us. Maybe they'll do some video with, you know, o- aside, outside of the practice. They'll watch some video. They'll do some Again, they'll do some more maybe shadowing and then maybe co-treating with some other clinicians and things like that. But it's really much more organic. I don't think that we have like a checklist of we need to make sure that you've accomplished this skill and this skill and this skill and this skill. Now, again, though I say that, and then I'll sort of, I guess, go backtrack and say there have been times when I'll see that a clinician is struggling with things like maybe active listening
Mhm.
or slowing down. I think that's the number one thing I see people struggle with the most is being, slowing down. Like they want to solve all the problems in the first three
Yeah.
sessions. And so, I mean, but I think that that's a natural part of being a new clinician. So, we do those kinds of trainings from the beginning. So we don't have a specific learning plan per se for supervisees after the graduate school level. Um, but we will put in place like this is something that we're seeing an area where you have some need for growth. So in the next quarter, we'd like to see you do these kinds of activities to move you to this. And then we'll be evaluating this and discussing this at the end of the quarter. So we do evaluate it sort of on a quarterly basis. Does that make sense? Is that kind of how you do
Yeah.
it too?
No,
No.
I love an assessment. So I just make one. It's not formalized, by any, you know, it's not been through any process. It's a very informal assessment, but it basically looks at the types of populations that they already feel comfortable with. It asks them to identify two populations that they would be willing to grow
Mm,
in,
mhm,
because I do think that clinicians should always be challenging themselves as well and being open. And part of that comes from I never thought I would want to do couples work. And until I had a couple in front of me and then just started to roll with it and have curiosity around it, I realized I absolutely love doing couples work. The same with groups. I never had any interest in groups, but my internship groups were very much part of that. And I was thrown into them. I say thrown. I was not thrown. I was made to do it when I was uncomfortable and did it anyway. And I love group work. So, had someone not pushed that and really required me to challenge myself, I would miss out on two populations that I absolutely love and do really well with. And so, I want them to have that same experience. But as part of that, I also am assessing their learning style. So, I have really candid, funny questions. Like, I like big books and I cannot lie, or can we just make that a fun learning activity? Or do you have an infographic on that? So I ask their learning style because I really want to know what is going to gain their interest and how they're going to learn best and connect to the material so that I can be really creative in the ways that I am putting things together. And then we're also currently developing these learning tracks in a learning academy and developmental career tracks as well. And each of those will have actual skills checks within them. So they'll be on different tracks that they'll choose as well. So that will be a little more formalized. But we're still just in the works with that.
Yeah, I think that that can be a really powerful opportunity for people in your practice to grow in a really obviously like systematic way that helps them to move along in, gaining skills and really, really developing powerfully. I love that. I love that assessment. I want to see that. That seems
Yes.
like a lot of fun. All right, you'll have to share that with me.
I will.
So a couple other questions on this particular clinical supervisor self-assessment. Um, I love this one, the ability to nurture supervisees' trust in me. I think
Mm.
that that's, I think automatically a lot of us say yes, of
All right.
course, we have that ability. Of course we can do that. Um, and yet it's not as easy as it sounds, and it's not as automatic as it might seem like it should be. And so I think that that really is a nuanced question that requires a lot more thought. And we always talk about, or I know you and I always talk about the idea that clear is kind.
Mhm.
And so a lot of these things around, setting up your boundaries, making your, very clear how you're going to do things, how you're going to conduct supervision, how you keep track of hours, when you're going to meet, showing up on time, all of those kinds of things, which seem sort of restrictive, are actually about building trust.
Yes,
And
and that parallels right into the building rapport with a client, and
mhm,
how often so many feel that's an easy process
mhm,
until they meet an avoidant client, and then they're like, met with this person 5 times now, and then we're just not getting anywhere, and I don't think they're a good fit for me, and it's like, "No, that's your pacing." And those same things, or even things like holding boundaries around payment and
right.
collecting payment, or clinicians shifting schedules, or all those things. They're all the same things. They feel they're being mean when it's actually that you're just being clear.
Right. Or frequently changing your schedule or canceling your schedule or not understanding the regulations of your state. And so you're like, well, I'm not really not sure how that's being done, or that doesn't really, that's not really important. Like, be really clear. Like, if you don't know something, then go find out what the answer is. Because again, the clearer you are and the more you're able to say, this is how it's done, this is how I do it, this is what is the way this is the way that we're going to be working together and moving together over the next
Yeah.
100 hours, 200 hours, whatever we're going to be working together. That's how you establish that sense of trust. And if you don't do that from the beginning, you're going to start out shaky anyway.
Mhm.
So I think that that's really powerful.
And I made a
Um,
lot of assumptions, and I'll state that for any, supervisors who may need to hear this. Please don't assume that the schools have prepared these students for what is after graduation. I felt really well prepared by my school. I felt like I understood exactly what I needed, how long it was supposed to take. And so I only really looked to the supervisor to tell me when we would meet, how to cancel, all those different things. But I have found that a lot of students do not know that, or new clinicians. And it's not to say the schools aren't covering it. I know that people need to hear something an average of 7 times to get it. And so if they're worried about passing their, you know, see, their like final exam, I always get the letters wrong. I always say it wrong because there's so many. But if they're worried about that, they're not going to be hearing the teacher when they're saying that, or the professor. So
right.
I would just state, don't make the assumption that they understand the journey to licensure, because they most of the time they really need it to hear it again, and they're looking to you to show them with clarity what that looks like. And I made that
Right.
assumption. I was always confused why they were asking all these questions, and that can erode trust when it's not
Well,
there.
right, and supervisees don't know what questions to ask. So,
Mhm.
I know that there have been times when I've had supervisees who have come to me for supervision who have really, unfortunately, have had experiences with supervisors who were the supervisors were very skilled at supervision, but were very unaware of the regulations and had really kind of created difficulties for them because they not recorded hours or had big sort of blocks of time where they didn't meet, and really kind of created difficult situations for the supervisee, and the supervisee doesn't know to ask about those kinds of things.
Mhm.
So another item on this supervision self-assessment, or the supervisor self-assessment, is protecting the supervisee's privacy.
Mm.
And I do think that there is a little bit of gray here. um I do think that the supervisee has a right to privacy and supervision. I absolutely do. And I also think that um it we always have to balance out what we're keeping private versus what needs to be taken to an outside counselor sort of scenario or setting. And if something is private, it shouldn't be in the notes, right? It shouldn't be in the
Right.
supervision notes. Um, I recently was talking to a supervisor who keeps supervision notes, and
Mhm.
they said, "Well, I don't really keep, like, I don't really write anything in the supervision notes other than that we met because I want to maintain the supervisee's privacy." And I said, "Well, that I understand that, and keeping the supervisee's privacy is important, and also keeping note of the content of the supervision session is also important so that we can monitor their growth and progress around specific themes." And so,
What I also feel like from a like, I've created a note, and one of that is professional developmental concerns. And I think that sometimes you need to notate those things because that covers you as well. Like if I have observed that there is a real struggle around, managing transference or boundaries, and I've made a comment of some sort of, we need to monitor this and you may need to seek some outside counseling. That needs to be documented. I don't have
mhm,
to document the details
right,
unless it's created some harm or some risk to the client that's known to the client, but or could potentially, turn into a situation. But if I don't document that for the sake of keeping the privacy, like that's harm that could be harmful to me should something happen.
right. Well, and I think that there's a point where, I guess I'm wondering where, I don't know. I think that there's a bigger conversation to supervision notes. I think that we should have another episode about supervision notes,
Oh yeah, that would be
because
good.
I think that there's a bigger question about supervision notes. If you're an employed by a group practice and you're the supervisor, and the supervisor and the group practice owner can both view those notes as well as the supervisee, and then you're maybe in academia, and though that people in academia can view those notes, I think that it's a bigger conversation. But there's something, something about some we need to talk about protect on this assessment. There's this issue of protecting supervisees privacy, but let's make a note that we need to talk about
Yeah,
notes.
that sounds like a
um
whole episode in
yeah,
itself.
I think there's a lot to talk about. I know that it's come up for me. So um, another one is the ability to help the supervisor connect theory with practice. Of course, that's something that we're doing just constantly, connecting theory to practice, connecting theory to practice. You certainly mentioned countertransference issues and discussing them comfortably and productively, and those are really really important things. And then, of course, ethical and legal matters are really critical to the to the discussion, and whether or not the supervisor feels like they're able to have knowledge of ethical and legal matters and also bring them up in supervision in an appropriate way.
Mhm.
So those are some of the items. There are plenty more, of course, using a written and oral feedback, and ability to separate emotional reactions to the supervisee from objective reality when
Mhm.
evaluating the supervisee. I thought that was a pretty good one. Comfort tolerating supervisees' inadequacies or problems during the learning process. What do you think about that one?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and,
Yeah.
like, I think that's that distortion of competence again,
Hmm.
and really understanding and having to take a look at yourself as a supervisor and remember how you developed what you developed and when, and really putting yourself in the shoes of the supervisee and remembering where you were at that stage because it's so easy to forget.
Right. So if we look at the supervisee's evaluation of the supervisor, which is another assessment that we'll include in the show notes, there are quite a few items that the supervisor, this is a Likert scale, a little bit different type
Mhm.
of assessment, evaluative strategy, but it has strongly agree, agree, no opinion, disagree, strongly disagree. And some of the items here include the same kinds of ones that we're talking about. But talk about I'm satisfied, the supervisor met my needs and expectations, helped me develop my skills. I really liked this one. The supervisor was open to my opinions, concerns, problems, questions, and confusions.
Mhm.
I really, really like that. I really,
Yes.
really like that. The supervisor helped me to develop my clinical skills at a pace that was sufficiently challenging yet appropriate to my level of development. That
Mhm.
idea of pacing I thought was really, really good.
Yes, I love that
Mhm.
it's emphasized because again, I the parallel process is just the most fascinating thing to me in any clinical work between, clients and clinicians and then clinicians and supervisors and it's just everywhere. I'm a pattern girl. So, um it so often gets I think overlooked at how much the modeling is necessary and how frequently that when you meet with a supervisee and you're having to model in the pacing of the learning, like you're
Right.
helping create and strengthen these implicit, like the implicit experience and wiring for them that they can then carry into session with their clients so that then they're not feeling like anxious to push the process. So there's so much you can do in just embodying the very thing that we're seeking to bring out in them so that they can have the felt sense of what it feels like to have that respect and autonomy and have someone alongside them developing them.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, this was a good one too. The supervisor helped me to understand and appropriately react to the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of my clients.
Mm,
So, I mean, there's going to be a lot that comes up in session, and being able to understand and appropriately react to those things and then, move on from those reactions. I think is a really powerful strategy to be able to support a clinician on. So I thought that was a really good one. Um, of course, one of the things that I get a lot, because I seem to get a lot of supervisees who come from school and a school setting, and that's mostly because my background is in education and schools,
uh-huh.
is to be able to help to accurately diagnose and conceptualize the treatment approach. Because clinicians that come from schools have not had diagnostics. And
That's right.
so they're coming with, very limited. I mean, it's not that they don't know, but it's a limited understanding of diagnostics and treatment planning. And so I spend a lot of time, I think, on diagnostics and treatment planning, and that's an area where I think we could probably all continue to grow and develop, because I'm not sure that we spend enough time in that area. I don't know.
Yes.
What do you
And I
think?
and well, I mean, I in grad school, I was referred to as a DSM Nazi because I was so good with the DSM. But I think it's because I love assessments, I love patterns. I also think it's because I intentionally took an undergrad class as part of my social work program, as part of my minor in psychology that I didn't need, but I wanted it anyway so I could take those classes. I'd already had a class in diagnosis and treatment. And so I was just really regaining things that I already knew. So I just was really good at it. But it's odd because as a more experienced clinician, there's so much of the DSM that I just have so many root cause problems with as far as like can we just keep yeah, like they feel like yes that is a diagnosis, yes it's there, and yet why are we not putting the root cause diagnosis of a lot of things in there, which that's a whole bigger discussion. So, but what I will say that is important for those of you who may ride and kind of straddle both sides of that and can possibly struggle with that is it's just important to always understand that you can be in both places. It's a both and. I can think that developmental trauma should be in the DSM and it would eliminate about 85% of that potentially. And I can also accept and acknowledge that we are not there yet, and one day we might be, and one day we may not, and I can still educate and teach my supervisees and be able to open the door to that level of understanding around the root cause piece and accept that these are diagnoses, that they were, they weren't just thrown there, that they do have a
Right.
lot of thought that's gone into it and a lot of work. And so holding the space and of that both and, which I think is really important, and the nuance and the complexities around that, because there's a lot of that in the field, and so often people wanna just follow the rule and do the right thing, and I'm like, sometimes the right thing isn't the either or the or, but it's both.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I love this one on here. It talks about the supervisor created an environment where I was permitted to disagree, question, or challenge his or her thinking.
Yes.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
I'm not really great at that. I'm I'm just gonna admit I'm not great at that. I mean,
'Cause
I'm
you're a D on the disc,
I
that's
think
why.
I know exactly. I do think I am open to feedback. I really am. Do I appreciate it? Okay, yes, I appreciate it. I don't like it. I'm just gonna say it. I don't like it, but I do appreciate it, and I once I get it and have dealt with it, I'm
Yeah.
good with it. I appreciate it, but
Is
it's
it that
hard in the
you don't like
process.
it when you so do you is it that you just don't like it?
I don't
I'm
like to be
wondering if you
wrong.
I'm wondering if you need I mean, now, yes, I have a high D too. I don't really like to be wrong. But what I notice sometimes is it's harder for me if I don't see it coming. Um,
Oh, yeah.
so almost like in a group setting, if I don't see it coming and it almost feels like if it were to feel like a direct challenge, like it can be a minute for me to orient what's underneath that or where that's coming from. So I think sometimes even just permitting people to challenge and maybe telling them how to introduce the challenge might help, because I find that once that happens, it's almost exciting that they're like thinking outside the box. And I'm like, okay, maybe.
Maybe.
Versus well, I'm kind of wondering if da 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 da, and then it's like, what is bringing this dynamic about? Like it almost it's more of the catching off guard and not knowing that it's coming, and it being in a group
Hmm.
setting, which could then influence others. And like I think that's the part I don't like is and so I like it if they're going to challenge me. I just need it's almost like I need to know that we're in the challenge space, and I'm like, "Oh, okay, let's go."
Okay, so I need like a preparation, like someone to say, okay, this is the time now for us to ask questions or
Maybe,
for
I
us to
don't know.
question that.
I would
Yeah.
just observe it if it's different in one to one
Yeah.
versus a group
Interesting. Interesting.
for you, like, if it feels different from one or to the other.
Yeah. So I want to wrap up our discussion of assessments with this last one, which is Carol Fallender's, and Carol Fallender is um, the OG of supervision, and or just really,
Goat,
really the
goat.
goat, really the goat. Yeah, we shouldn't say OG because she's not old, but she's definitely the goat, and has created a competent supervisor competency framework that includes a series of knowledge, skills, values, social context, overarching issues, training of supervision competencies, assessments, and things, areas to consider. And really, this particular self-assessment asks for if these areas are present or if they're aspirational. And so this is an area, this is an assessment that, unlike the two that we've already covered, which are kind of ones that you would maybe use at the beginning of your supervision relationship or at the end, this is one that you could use at both the beginning and at the end. And so, as a supervisor, I really love that you could use this competency framework at the beginning of your supervisor journey, at the beginning before you even start as a supervisor, and then as you move through it, this could be a living document that you could
Mhm.
use as you become more competent and as you grow in your supervisory skills. So um, knowledge and around professional supervisee development, evaluation, awareness of diversity, skills in relationships, sensitivity to multiple roles, promoting group growth and self-assessment. And there's a whole series of areas, teaching and didactic skills, values of responsibility for client and supervisee, respectfulness, value of ethical principles, commitment to knowing one's own limitations, uh, the social context overarching issues of diversity, ethnicity, the developmental process. I mean, just a whole series of things. And I really appreciate the idea of saying that these are already areas where I feel competent in the present, or these are aspirational areas for me. And I would love us both, even. I'm going to do it myself. And I
Yeah,
think you
let's
should
hear
do
it
it
and
too.
share it.
I think we should share it because I definitely think there are probably several of these that I feel like they're aspirational for even me, who and I'm sure probably for you too,
Oh,
who've been doing this
absolutely.
for years. And I have no shame in sharing that I have areas where I definitely need to continue to grow.
Yes.
Um and again, I love that this could be a living document for anyone that's working on their competency as a supervisor. I think we forget in the field, and I think one of the goals for me for this podcast is to merge the individuals who are in academia who have doctorates in counselor education and supervision, and those who are in the professional field of practice who don't necessarily have doctorates in supervision,
Yes.
but who are also doing supervision, because the training is different, when you
Mhm.
have a doctorate and you have coursework that covers modalities of supervision and a variety of different things, and then you are outside the academic world and you're getting trained in supervision and very different sort of competencies. And so I'm really hoping from this that we merge those two worlds together with this podcast, because there's absolutely room for both of those, and we can learn from each other so
Yes,
much. And
absolutely.
we need to be having conversations together about how to be one group, one entity of supervisors, and grow together and learn and teach and train each other, and
Yes.
not be not that we're separate, but not be separate, and the competencies need to be the same for everyone. And so I really hope that that's sort of an aspirational, if we're talking about aspirations, that's
Yeah.
an aspirational goal for me, um,
And
for
I think
this.
it's a similarity also when you think about professors in academia. There's so many professors in academia who have not ever ran a practice or had their own private practice, or may have only practiced in agencies. And so they are really well versed from an educational standpoint on theories and on things, but then there can be a loss of some of that when it comes to like the experiential pieces of that. Whereas we in who are no longer in academia, although I've been a professor before but no longer one, we can really lose pieces of that. And and so that can become aspirational. Like there's so much to be gained from both of those
Yes.
sides of things. And I think you're right. Like to be able to bridge that, I always feel we're stronger like always going to be stronger together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So thanks for sharing all of these assessments and talking with them with me today, Valerie. I really appreciate it. And thanks to our
Yeah.
audience for tuning in to Supervision Simplified. The revolution starts with you. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and share it with your network. We're eager for your comments to hear more about your assessments that you use with your supervisees, your stories, and your feedback to ensure that we're hitting all the topics that you care about. Keep simplifying and elevating your supervision game. And until our next episode, we'll see you again soon. Thanks so much.
Bye.